Queridos estudiantes, señoras y señores. That's as far as I will go in Spanish. Maybe if I come back in a year or two, I'll do my talk in Spanish. I really admire Tim's ability to do so. I will, let's see. I will talk about something that I regard as very important. It's kind of theoretical, but I will use experiences from different countries as examples. Being a professor, I have to be founded in theory, of course, and I know there are lots of students here, and so I will try my best to give a little intuition for the theoretical foundation. The theme is fairly clear, and the idea is that the predictability of what's going to happen in various nations, it varies a lot, and it varies across regions, and within regions it varies across countries. And I'll try to give what I regard as a main reason for that. Well, first of all, the decisions that make the private economy decisions that make nations grow, they are very forward-looking. They're dynamic. People have to think forward in making these decisions. These forward-looking decisions are decisions that affect the productivity of nations, innovative activity, development of new products that will be popular in that country or maybe all over the world, development of new ways of making things more efficiently. Those are very forward-looking decisions because they typically involve a high cost today, and those high costs they'd better be matched by returns in the future. When I teach undergraduate macroeconomics, say intermediate macro, I start the first lecture by saying all interesting phenomena in macroeconomics are dynamic, they're forward-looking. That's only a little bit of an overstatement. But I also had to warn the students who have not gotten started yet, that's also what makes macroeconomics hard to do on paper. So be forewarned, but it's worth it. It's extremely interesting in my opinion. Anyway, so this is the background, and now comes the finding that I will emphasize from economic theory, namely, if one can imagine calculating the optimal plan for the government to follow. Unfortunately, that plan is inconsistent over time. I will talk more about the reasons for that, but the consequences could be dire. First of all, one possibility is that a nation seems to be following a good policy, but there is the danger. One knows from theory there's a temptation to change in the future. And we also know from theory that the consequences of doing so can be very bad for society. An alternative is that policymakers have already become tempted to fall into that short-run trap, maybe time after time, in which case, admittedly, policy is reasonably predictable, but it's bad for society. And then the question is, what can be done about that? So I believe that a firm or deep understanding of those 2 points equips one to think about many countries in the world, including the situation in Spain. You'll see that the examples I'm going to use are taken from all over the world, United States, Latin America. I already talked about Norway, but their European Union and the Eurozone are very interesting nations. I will also say a few words about a couple of very young nations, Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan. I think they are also, one can get interesting lessons from looking at them. Now, to get started, let's look at it may seem like an idiosyncratic collection of nations. This is real GDP per capita. For many purposes, as Tim did, it's more useful to do it per working age person, but I'll simply do per capita, which translates into real income per capita. So that's a key reason why these are illustrative charts to look at. And this chart, this is in constant dollars, so it's real. It's actually in 2005 dollars. That data happened to be in constant in 2005 dollars. If you want to know what these charts would, what the magnitudes would be today, you had to multiply by 1 plus the inflation that has taken place over that time. So you would multiply each one by 1.15 roughly. So this goes from 0 to $40,000 per person. The United States is at the top of this picture. Modesty kept me from including Norway in the picture. So it's an interesting collection of countries, with some that have grown fairly fast, such as some East Asian countries, Taiwan, Korea, for example, and then countries that don't seem to be growing much at all. And there are some Latin American countries in here. I have Chile, Argentina, Mexico. At the bottom, actually, is China. Now, there's a lot of talk about China overtaking the United States in a few years in terms of total size. It just shows that small income per capita multiplied by a large number of people can amount to a large number. Most people, or a lot of people, get surprised when they see how low income per capita is in China. I'll get back to some of these countries. And then as I promised, there's Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan. These came into being with the breakup of the Soviet Union in the early 90s. These are examples of countries with a great deal of resources. As Tim pointed out, sometimes when a country owns lots of resources, lots of oil, for example, it can ruin that country. Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan, they're trying to prove that they will not be ruined by the prevalence of oil. So they have grown very fast. I should point out, by the way, this is not a picture in proportional scale. So a given steepness of a curve when you're far down in the picture will correspond to a much higher growth rate per year than the same steepness high up in the picture. So these are very impressive growth rates for those two countries. I'll say a few words come back to those two once I introduce a little theory. And the beginning here will be very elementary to economists. I'm just indicating that in the long run, growth depends on three factors. GDP is a function of capital and labor. So one combines factories and machines, office buildings with the employees, and out comes the goods we care about. Goods and services, consumption goods, investment goods that make increase the capacity to produce in the future. The government takes its share, and then there's the difference between exports and imports. So it's a function of capital and labor input, but in front of that function is this important factor that Tim emphasized a lot, the technology level, which is more or less the same as productivity. Now, this function is central to all of macroeconomics. Whenever I think of some phenomenon, let's say the central bank is trying to do something or other, how does this translate into the production function? And the Z is so important. I've made technological progress bold-faced. I've tried to illustrate visually which direction is supposed to go. Now, the key to my talk is going to be what happens to these variables. Oh, before I leave it, let me just say a few words about the L. So L, the labor input, is not just a matter of adding up the population or the number of workers. The L should be weighted by how skillful the workers are in market production. And so you students are doing your best to become more skillful, to accumulate more human capital, as we call it. When that's the case, your input will be weighted more heavily than someone who, for various reasons, did not make the same kind of investment. It's kind of interesting to observe a country like Kazakhstan, because they have now tried to do put the oil to best use to make the economy better for the citizen to grow faster in the long run. But they have discovered a bottleneck, and that is they are starting to have a shortage of skilled people. If you grow really fast and the education system is not designed to keep up with that growth, you may run into that sort of bottleneck, a shortage of skilled people. And that's something they have realized, and they're doing their best to develop the educational system. So the key driving force behind economic growth is technological change, which will give rise to higher productivity in the nation. Just to give you the big picture, what happens under healthy economic growth, Z increases, capital is built to take advantage of the technological change. The businesses hire workers, and their incomes rise. In a well-functioning economy, usually incomes rise, or the wages rise in lockstep with the increases in productivity. If wages rise substantially more than is suggested by productivity, then that's a sign that something is wrong. And that presumably that was one of Spain's problems. Now, the key here is that the government policy may be crucial to what happens to these variables. And it could be crucial either in a positive way or in a negative direction. And I'll give as examples Argentina and Ireland in the 1990s, maybe early 2000. Maybe I shouldn't have indicated which one is negative and which one is positive and let you guess, but I don't think there would have been much doubt about that. So you will notice that I will emphasize a lot fiscal policy. And the reason for that is, under normal circumstances, fiscal policy is much more important for long-run growth than is monetary policy. There's not that much monetary policy can do, except in a crisis situation, of course, they can take necessary actions, such as in 2008. Much of what, for example, the central bank in the United States did was a reasonable thing to do, but not something that really is instrumental to long-run growth. Fiscal policy can be much more important. There are examples of policy measures that I wouldn't regard as particularly wise. In the United States, they tried to stimulus through temporary tax rebates. Well, economic theory already tells us such a policy measure is likely to have little effect. This tax rebates are likely to be saved largely and not have much effect on the aggregate economy. So, is stimulus spending wise? Well, what I said suggests that it's not wise, especially for a country that is running into budget problems for the government. Now, if the spending is well designed and well thought out, such as spending on infrastructure, education, research, things that can affect in a positive way future productivity, then of course it could be very well worth the extra debt needed to pay for it. So now I come to the reason for point number 2 in my introduction. And this comes from a theory of a benevolent government. So I'd like you to think about an idealized environment. Economists try to learn from environment where you abstract from unnecessary complications to make that point, and I'm going to ask you to bear with me to imagine the following. Suppose a benevolent policymaker existed in this nation. He or she would be able to quantify or come up with a mathematical expression for citizens' welfare now and indefinitely into the future. So that's what he would strive to optimize, to make as high as possible. And presumably he would take into account the effect this plan, especially including the future portion of this plan, of this policy, would have on earlier decisions. So, for example, because investment decisions on expanding productive capacity are very much forward-looking, large expense to build a factory today, millions or maybe $100 million. Those expenses, if this is a wise decision, ought to be matched by returns in the future, the present value of those returns in the future. And what matters are the returns after taxes. So this little example suggests in a forward-looking, dynamic environment, future government policy is helpful. Knowing about the future policy environment is helpful to lead businesses to make these decisions. And this plan by the benevolent policymaker presumably would take into account the effect the policy plan 5-10 years into the future would have on decisions this year, next year, and so on. Unfortunately, that plan, and this is economic theory, this plan is inconsistent over time. Anytime in the future there'll be a temptation to change the plan, because it seems at the time, if you were to recalculate that plan, you would come up with a completely different plan. And the intuition for that is tied in with, for example, in the example I gave of decisions about future capacity. Once that capacity has been built, it's already there. 5 years from now, the policymaker will have little incentive to take into account the effect of the policy, the continuation of the policy for decisions that have already been made. If the policymaker perceived an emergency situation, for example, and for some reason policymakers have an easy time claiming emergency situations, they'd be tempted to revert the policy and, for example, tax the income from the already constructed factories more heavily than he had promised. So you might ask, where is this temptation the greatest? Well, naturally it would be in the situation where policy affects something that you build up over time, including physical capital. It could be in the context of human capital. Also, it's a possible way to solve the debt problem, something that Latin American countries were very adept at doing a few decades ago. They could renege, at least partially, sometimes fully, on its debt by engineering a surprise inflation, like a hyperinflation, as we call it. So I suggested that it's inconsistent. The optimal policy is inconsistent. And by the way, so this was in an idealized environment. You can imagine the way political processes work in practice, and the situation is likely to be even worse than this problem in the most idealized environment. So this problem calls for some way to committing future governments to its best policy, what we could call a commitment mechanism. Do such commitment mechanisms exist? Well, the examples I could point to are, well, there's a very old example, the gold standard, which I would view in this light. There's the attempt in Argentina in the early 90s when Carlos Menem came to power, after what Tim referred to as a lost decade of terrible decade in Argentina, with ending in a hyperinflation, people losing their pensions, the government debt dropping to zero. Carlos Menem decided to tie the Argentine peso to the dollar, 1 for 1. They accumulated enough reserves so that this seemed like a credible policy. Argentina seemed to grow fairly fast for something like 8 years, and then everything fell apart again. I'll show you a picture in a while. What they forgot to do was solve their fiscal problems. Fiscal policy can never be, monetary policy can never be viewed in complete isolation from fiscal policy. So in Argentina, even though the economy grew fairly fast in the 90s, the provinces kept borrowing to an extent that towards the end of the decade, it became clear they would not pay back their debt. So then they came running to the federal government, who was obliged to bail them out. And as a consequence, the federal debt ballooned. And if you talk to someone like Carvalho, who was in charge of was a finance minister, he will agree that was the key problem. Now, if during this description you forgot that I was talking about Argentina and for a second thought I was talking about Spain, you'll be forgiven. So I think that's an example from which a lot can be learned. Now the main, so that turned out to be a commitment mechanism that did not work in the end. What seems to have worked pretty well in some countries is to make central banks independent. So that's a way to make monetary policy more benign, more transparent, more predictable, trying to isolate the central bank from political pressure. And here, well, the Bundesbank in Germany used to be the master of predictability, transparency, and so on. The central bank in the United States has been not that far behind. In fact, one of the signs of a predictable monetary policy is that the head doesn't change very often. So if you go back to for the past 60 years or so in the United States, how many heads have they had? 6. The last of which is Ben Bernanke, as you know. You take a central bank that's clearly not independent from the rest of the government. That in Argentina. In Argentina, if you go, I went back to 1945. That's a period of 67 years. I counted the number of heads of the Central Bank of Argentina. 54 heads, which means that on the average each head served for 1.25 years. In the especially tumultuous period, or a year around 2002, the head changed 3 times in under a year. You may have heard about the latest change. A couple of years ago, Cristina Fernández de Kirchner wanted her hands on the central bank's reserves. The then head refused. What happened then? Fired. Replaced by a new head, and Cristina got her hands on the reserves of the Argentine Central Bank. Now, these commitment mechanisms are mostly in the context of or all in the context of monetary policy. It's not so obvious how to commit to fiscal policy, to good fiscal policy. And that's unfortunate because part of my message is fiscal policy is much more important for long-run growth than is monetary policy. So it would behoove us to try to think of such, for economists to try to think of such mechanisms. I sometimes joke that if some young hotshot economist comes up with the solution to this commitment problem for fiscal policy, in 30 years he'll stand on a stage in Stockholm and shake hands with the King of Sweden. So here is the picture for the post-war period for Argentina, just to show how bad things can go wrong. This is on proportional scale, so or on a log scale, as we say, we take log of the numbers. This is real GDP per working age person. I quickly learned from Tim and did per working age person. And as if you're familiar with log scale, and if you can see the numbers on the vertical axis, you can already work out that this drop from about 1980 to 1990, over 20%. Huge drop. Then the curve looks rather steep and upward sloping in the 90s until about 1998, things fall apart again. And there's another drop of over 20%, this time in a much shorter time period. It turns out that even this increase in the 90s, if you plug in numbers for the best measurements for the Z from my earlier slide, for Argentina, the economy should have grown much faster. Investments should have been much higher, even in the 1990s, in light of the time path of the empirical time path of the Z, which suggests to well, this was a study that I did with Carlos Arzaga at the Dallas Fed, and we suggest this is I mean, it's like applying a thermometer to a person who looks like he's not doing so well. If the thermometer shows 37, well, it can't be too bad. He's probably quite healthy. If it shows 40, then something is wrong. To Carlos and me, the fact that the standard model suggested that in the light of the movement of Z, the economy should have grown substantially faster, suggested to us Argentina, its temperature is up around 40 rather than 37. Here's maybe the most depressing part of that story. This is a picture of of Argentina's capital stock per working age person. The peak of that picture took place 30 years ago, 1982. They still haven't recovered. You may say that this picture stops in 2009, but the reason is Argentina, the current administration loves tinkering with the data. They misstate the data, or they try to make it as difficult as possible to see exactly what's going on. This is well known in the case of their reports of inflation rates, but also here in the case of capital stock, they changed the data so that current data are not easily comparable. But Carlos, my friend from the Dallas Fed, who's actually from Argentina originally, he is convinced that Argentina, if we had the data through now, it still hasn't recovered to the old peak. Now, It could be that there had been a little bit of overinvestment going into 82, but not to this extent. And this red curve suggests what the growth of the capital stock should have been in a well-functioning nation. So this disease, the reason Argentina's thermometer showed 40 rather than 37 or something like that, we refer to as suffering from the time inconsistency disease due to the memory of what happened in the 1980s, and that wasn't the only history or event in the memory of at least Argentines who had lived for a number of years. This is a picture similar to the first picture, except a collection of European countries. It includes countries such as Denmark, Great Britain, France, Germany, kind of moving along at the top of the picture through most of this period, and then more towards the bottom, countries such as Greece, Italy, Spain, well below these other countries. An interesting country is Ireland. Ireland, about 1990, the precondition for Ireland was pretty good. They had been doing poorly, or relatively poorly for a while, but they had a good precondition, namely they had made secondary education free of charge about 20 years before, and so they found themselves with a potentially skillful workforce. They just didn't have any capital with which to work, to put their skills to use. So what did Ireland do? The politicians decided, we're going to make the investment environment as predictable as we can. They told potential investors, foreign or domestic, if you invest in Ireland, if you set up capacity to produce here, this will be your tax rate in 1992, this will be in 1993, and so on, all the way to 2009. A typical rough lifetime of a factory. I'm not saying that was the only thing they did, but that has to have been an important factor to commit to this, to the tax environment for almost 2 decades in the future. And you can see the effect it had on Ireland. Ireland took off dramatically to an extent that in about 10 years or less, they had overtaken all of these other nations. Now, I wish Ireland were a success story with a good, with a happy ending. It's not. So part of the problem was, as Ireland started to become more and more wealthy, there was also a debt finance construction boom in Ireland. And so that accounts for part of what happened as you go into the 2000s. As a consequence, when the crisis hit in around 2008, several of the biggest banks in Ireland were in big trouble. They were illiquid, and the head of the government made it seemed like a panic decision to bail out these banks at a huge cost to taxpayers. Very questionable decision, both from the point of view of the cost to taxpayers, but also it's not clear that such a decision would be a wise decision in terms of aligning incentives from the point future incentives for the banks. So Ireland has suffered since, but to me that doesn't take away from the success of that policy as an illustration of the importance of policy consistency and good policy for the importance in the 1990s. This is my second sad picture. I mean, in addition to the one for the capital stock in Argentina. The picture for Argentina is sad because the predictable consequences is real wages will be lower than they need to be. For many years, poverty rates kept rising, although lately Argentina has been you might say lucky because the prices of their resources have been high, agricultural products and minerals, so that the lack of productive capacity, the lack of capital per worker hasn't hurt it as much, but if those prices were to fall, problems would come back to Argentina. This is a picture for some African countries, sub-Saharan African countries. You'll recall the previous scale in the previous two pictures. It went from 0 to 40,000. This goes from 0 to 10,000, and the 10,000 was needed only because I decided to include Botswana in the picture. Botswana is another example of a country that with lots of resources, and a country that has managed those resources, diamonds in particular, relatively well by African standards. Many of these other countries have lots of resources as well, and obviously not managed them that well. They have been hovering under $5,000 per person, some down under $1,000 per person. Countries with great opportunities, but for various reasons, lack of good institutions, lots of corruption and so on, they've had trouble getting off the ground. Now, to most people in the world, what happens in the United States is of some interest, because of the size of the U.S. economy, and it's, you might argue that it can have a considerable effect on what happens in the rest of the world. So Tim had a similar picture, except it went back much further so that he could see the Great Depression. This is just the period from 1947 until almost today. Real GDP per capita. Again, this is on proportional scale, so that straight line corresponds to a constant growth rate. In fact, it's the average growth rate from 1947 to 2007 extended to the present. So that straight line works pretty well, just like the straight line in Tim's picture. There are ups and downs, of course, corresponding to the business cycle. There was a big one by post-war standards ending in 1982. The economy bounced back quickly from that big drop. And in fact, that used to be typical of business cycles. You would bounce back quickly. Then we have the drop in 2008, 2009. That's a huge drop by post-war standards. The economy dropped to 11 or 12% below that old trend. The bottom in 2009 the distance is 11 or 12% below that old trend. Now, there are different interpretations for what are the main reasons. One that, and this is in work with Carlos Sarasaga again, one thing we decided to do was, because of the growth of the debt to GDP ratio that had taken place through 2008, a doubling from 15 or 20 years before, we suggested that it became evident to many, especially those making forward-looking decisions, investment decisions, engaged in innovation and so on, that they might be the ones, in large part, having to pay for the buildup of debt in the form of future taxes. So we did this experiment in which we suggested that starting in 2013, which by the way is when taxes are due to go up anyway, unless Congress takes specific action, that taxes would go up enough to keep the debt to GDP ratio from rising. By the way, I forgot to show this picture, but this is simply the last portion of the previous one blown up so as to emphasize the most recent period. We did this experiment, took an off-the-shelf model of economic growth, and plugged in this scenario that I just described. And this, for example, is what the model said would happen to investment, which accounts pretty well for the large drop that took place. It's also interesting in the sense that it suggests that the recovery back towards the old trend will be slow. It could take 5 or 7 years or something like that. Another thing this model showed is that this scenario is likely on the assumption that the most of the tax increase falls on capital income, not on labor income. It also, I could show additional pictures. For example, it predicts that there would not be a sizable drop in consumption, and that's something that many have found puzzling. Why hasn't consumption dropped by more? A large article in the Wall Street Journal a few weeks ago on that puzzle. That scenario fits in well with this scenario. So, as you could see, there doesn't seem to be any tendency to move back towards the old trend, which goes counter to previous business cycles in the post-war period. If we look at recent data, so far in 2012, we've had 3 quarters. So far, the growth on an annual basis so far in 2012 in real GDP is 2%. Go back a little further, the last 2 years, 2%. Well, in the picture I showed you, the growth rate in the long run up through 2007 was 2% in real GDP per capita. So if we take into account that population grows by almost 1% per year, that suggests only a 1% growth rate in real GDP per capita. And this is over 2 years, the last 2 years. Instead of moving back towards the old trend, we're diverging so far. And people talk about fiscal cliff and the idea that we might drop into another recession in the United States if the scheduled tax increases as of January 1st, 2013 are not reversed. Carlos's and my exercise suggests the drop has already taken place. There doesn't need to be such a big drop in the future, but it's bad enough that we're not moving back towards the old trend. Those low growth rates are, that's a serious issue. Now, so I talked about the importance of consistent policy. But remember, there was the word optimal, which you could translate into good policy. Policy that appears consistent doesn't have to be a good thing. That's not sufficient. It could be that the government is carrying out in some country a fairly consistent policy, but it's a bad policy. And to me, China is an example of that. For the following reason, actually I didn't used to know much about China until I read an article published about a year ago in the American Economic Review, one of the top 3 journals in economics, by another Norwegian economist, Store Sletten, and a couple of his co-authors. The article was entitled Growing Like China. And what I learned from that article is the banking system in China leaves something to be desired. Almost the entire banking system in China, it's state-owned banks. These state-owned banks favor these large state-owned companies because of these companies' easy access to credit and so far to cheap labor. They've been able to show considerable profits in spite of not needing much technological advance. They don't need to be very innovative to show profits. Meantime, what are generally regarded as the main drivers of long-run economic growth of nations, the people with the ideas, the innovative ideas, often startup companies or small to medium companies, have a much harder time getting credit to put their ideas to fruition. So, more or less they're forced to save up in advance before they can put their ideas to use, and they get biased naturally towards more labor-intensive activities than otherwise. Because China started at such a low level in terms of income or real GDP per capita, they've still been able to show considerable growth rates in activity. But my guess is that this problem will come back to haunt them eventually. And in any case, that situation represents a terrible misallocation of resources. So, as I said in the beginning, behind these examples, often there are lessons that you could maybe learn from also in Spain, and I think this is another example. So in China, the way to deal with this would be to introduce more competition in the banking sector. But notice the emphasis on the new ideas, the innovators, their ability to get loans. So an interesting question to think about is, has Spain solved their banking problem? In the sense that banks are giving loans to these kinds of activities? If not, that's not good for the long run growth of the economy, and especially this badly needed growth in productivity. So that's something policymakers need to look. One of the most important things to take a look at, to make sure the incentives in the banks are such that not only do they fill their capital requirements, but also the banks are set up to promote this kind of long-run economic activity. I forgot when I started. Am I about out of time? Well, okay. This picture was meant to further illustrate the importance of a sound banking sector. I got this from Tim at some point, and this illustrates. Well, Tim alluded to Chile versus Mexico, along with Finland versus Japan. So I could amplify that story a little bit by saying that in 1982, both Mexico and Chile found themselves in a similar situation. Prices had dropped dramatically for the minerals or products, their main products, oil in the case of Mexico, copper in the case of Chile. World interest rates were high. In Chile, for example, banks accounting for half of the nation's deposits were illiquid. The government took over, decided which banks were viable for the long run, let the remaining ones go under. Within a couple of years, they reprivatized the remaining banks. Markets started to function, interest rates were quoted, credit started flowing to more or less the best users. In Mexico, realizing that the short-run cost of doing what Chile did could be high, as you see real GDP dropped by on the order of 15% in the first two years after this happened. In Chile, in Mexico, they decided to keep the banks in the hands of government officials. So if government officials could decide, well, you can get a loan, but you don't get a loan. And if you think government officials are the ones who know where are the best users of credit, you probably believe in Santa Claus. So this picture has been indexed so that both start at 100. And as you see, the drop in Mexico was not nearly as large as in Chile, but then Chile, relative to Mexico, took off, while Mexico kind of bumbled along at more or less an unchanged level. Eventually, they reprivatized the banks also, and of course, Mexico has done quite a bit better more recently. Well, let me just end with some summary remarks. I wouldn't call them conclusions, but more like remarks. Well, I would say a conclusion of what I talked about is that significant risks exist for the continuation of growth in many economies, depending on their institutions, their ability to avoid the time inconsistency disease that I've talked about. This kind of uncertainty about future policy, I think, is a main. I mean, it's very important for long-run growth, and maybe one of the most important problems. I couldn't emphasize more that designing policy for the long run is much more important than the short run. One of the signs of suffering from the time inconsistency disease, such as in Argentina, is that it seems that policy responds to very short run events. No looking ahead in the design of policy, and that's bad. I like to say that there's enough uncertainty in the world. We don't need more uncertainty coming from the government. Now, nations with credibility, I think now they have a great opportunity. If you lose credibility, it's very hard to rebuild it. I think Spain, for example, is a country with a great deal of credibility. Make sure you don't lose it. And I think there's a great opportunity now. Productivity has been low for, as Tim said, 17 years, or not growing. There's a great opportunity to make that curve go in the right direction. But in part, it requires long-run focus of the government. It requires that it does not lose its credibility. It requires that investors are confident that this is a place in which to make innovative ideas take place and for productive capacity to grow. Thank you very much.